A woman disguised herself as a man for years just to sail around the world and study plants, fooling an entire ship's crew for a surprisingly long time. One explorer was sold into slavery for 7 years before he even got close to his goal of reaching a legendary African kingdom. Another man traveled so much in the 1300s, mostly on foot or by small boat, that it was like going around the earth 3 times. An ancient Greek sailor told tales of a land where the sun never set in summer and the sea turned to slush, but everyone thought he was making it up for hundreds of years. And a prim Victorian lady, always in her proper black dress, paddled canoes through crocodile-infested rivers and once survived a fall into a tribal trap filled with sharp spikes. These are the stories of explorers you've probably never heard of, but whose journeys into the unknown were absolutely mind-blowing. Number 8. Hanno the Navigator and the mysterious, fiery river. Imagine setting sail from what is now Tunisia, way back in the 5th century BC, with 60 big ships each with 50 oars, packed with thousands of men and women. That's what Hanno the Navigator, a Carthaginian leader, reportedly did. Carthage was a powerful city-state in North Africa, a major rival to the early Romans and Greeks. Hanno's mission was to explore the northwestern coast of Africa, beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar, and establish new Carthaginian colonies. This was truly sailing off the edge of the known map for people of the Mediterranean world. His journey is mostly known from a short report called a periplus, which was supposedly inscribed on a tablet in a temple back in Carthage. A Greek version of this text survived. According to this account, Hanno and his fleet sailed south along the African coast for many days. They founded several towns and trading posts along the way, sticking close to the shore. The lands they encountered were often unfamiliar and populated by people whose languages they didn't understand. The further south they went, the stranger things got. They saw wild, fast-running people who threw stones and couldn't be caught. They came to a large river, possibly the Senegal River, teeming with crocodiles and hippopotamuses. They sailed past lands that were silent by day, but lit up with many fires at night, accompanied by the sounds of flutes, cymbals, and drums. This made the Carthaginians afraid, and their diviners told them to leave the area. One of the most striking parts of Hanno's account describes reaching a bay they called the Horn of the South. In this bay was an island, and on that island was a lake, and in that lake was another island full of savage people. The report says most were women, whose bodies were hairy, and whom their interpreters called gorillae. Carthaginians tried to capture some of them. They managed to catch 3 females, but these individuals were so fierce, biting and scratching, that they killed them and took their skins back to Carthage. Whether these were actual gorillas, another primate species, or perhaps a tribe of humans is still debated by historians. If they were gorillas, this would be one of the earliest recorded encounters between humans and these great apes. Perhaps the most dramatic sight Hanno reported was what they called the Chariot of the Gods. This was a very high mountain, blazing with fire at night, that seemed to touch the stars. During the day, it appeared as a tall mountain. This is widely believed to be a description of an active volcano, possibly Mount Cameroon in modern-day Cameroon, which is a massive volcano near the coast. They also described streams of fire flowing into the sea. The heat was so intense they couldn't walk on the land nearby. Terrified, they sailed away quickly. After this, their provisions began to run low, and they turned back towards Carthage. Hanno's voyage pushed the boundaries of Carthaginian knowledge of Africa, even if many details remain mysterious. Number 7. Francisco de Orellana's desperate voyage down the entire Amazon. Francisco de Orellana was a Spanish conquistador in the 16th century, a relative of the infamous Pizarro brothers who conquered the Inca Empire. In 1541, he joined an enormous expedition led by Gonzalo Pizarro, setting out from Quito in modern-day Ecuador. Their goal was to find El Dorado, the legendary city of gold and also a mythical land of cinnamon said to be east of the Andes Mountains. The expedition was huge, with hundreds of Spaniards, thousands of indigenous Andeans forced into service as porters, and countless animals like horses and llamas. Things went wrong almost from the start. They crossed the freezing Andes, where many of the porters died from cold and exhaustion. Then they descended into the dense, humid Amazon rainforest. The cinnamon they found was not the valuable spice they hoped for, and El Dorado was nowhere to be seen. Food ran out. Men and animals starved. They were plagued by insects, snakes, and tropical diseases. The jungle itself seemed determined to swallow them whole. Desperate, Gonzalo Pizarro ordered Orellana to take a specially built boat, a small brigantine named the San Pedro, and about 60 men to sail down a nearby river, the Coca River, which flowed into the Napo River. The idea was that Orellana would find food and return. He set off in December 1541. They sailed for days, but found little food and no signs of populated areas from which to get supplies. Current was strong, making a return trip upstream incredibly difficult, if not impossible. Orellana and his men faced a terrible choice: try an almost hopeless journey back against the current to a starving main party, or continue downstream into the unknown, hoping to find the great river they had heard tales of, which they believed might lead them to the ocean. Orellana later claimed his men convinced him to continue. Gonzalo Pizarro, when he realized Orellana wasn't coming back, accused him of treason and abandoning the expedition. Pizarro and the tattered remnants of his main group eventually struggled back to Quito, a disastrous failure. Meanwhile, Orellana and his small band committed themselves to the river. They were the first known Europeans to navigate the entire length of what would soon be called the Amazon River. Their journey was an epic of survival. They faced constant attacks from riverside indigenous communities who were not pleased to see these armed strangers. They had to fight for their lives many times. To get more supplies and better shelter, they would raid villages. They also suffered from hunger, disease, and the sheer psychological toll of being lost in an unimaginably vast wilderness. At one point, they had to stop and build a second larger brigantine, the Victoria, using materials scavenged from the forest and nails forged from horseshoes and other scrap metal. This took them weeks, all while fending off attacks. One of the most famous incidents of their voyage led to the river's name. Orellana's chronicler, a Dominican friar named Gaspar de Carvajal, whose diary is the main source for the journey, described a fierce battle with a tribe where tall, fair-skinned women fought alongside the men leading the warriors. Carvajal compared them to the Amazons, the mythical warrior women of Greek legend. Because of this encounter, Orellana named the river Rio de las Amazonas. It's also possible these were long-haired male warriors, or that the story was embellished to make their journey sound even more heroic. After 8 months and thousands of miles, in August 1542, Orellana's 2 small battered ships finally reached the Atlantic Ocean. They had charted a massive, previously unknown river system. Orellana eventually made it back to Spain, got royal permission to conquer and colonize the lands he had discovered, which he named New Andalusia. He set off with a new fleet in 1545, but died of disease and hunger trying to find the main channel of the Amazon again. Number 6. Alexandra David-Néel's Forbidden Journey to the Rooftop of the World. Imagine a time when Tibet, the remote high-altitude kingdom in the Himalayas, was strictly forbidden to foreigners. Now imagine a French-Belgian woman in her mid-50s, an opera singer turned Buddhist scholar and explorer, deciding she absolutely had to go to Lhasa, Tibet's capital city. That was Alexandra David-Néel, one of the most unconventional and determined explorers of the early 20th century. Born in 1868, Alexandra was fiercely independent from a young age. She became interested in Eastern religions and philosophy, traveling to India in her youth. She studied Sanskrit and Buddhism, and even lived in a cave in Sikkim, a Himalayan kingdom, for several years, learning from Tibetan lamas and practicing meditation. She adopted a Sikkimese boy, Offer Yongden, who became her lifelong companion and fellow traveler. Her dream was to reach Lhasa. By the early 1920s, Tibet was closed off. Several previous attempts by her to enter the country had been thwarted by British or Tibetan authorities. So, Alexandra decided the only way was to go in disguise. In 1923, at the age of 55, she and Yongden set off on an incredible journey. They disguised themselves as poor Tibetan pilgrims, a beggar lama and her son. Alexandra darkened her skin with soot and yak butter tea, wore ragged clothes and carried a begging bowl. She even learned to speak Tibetan fluently with a local accent. For 8 long months, they trekked across the treacherous, freezing high-altitude plateaus of Tibet. They faced blizzards, temperatures far below freezing, starvation, bandits, and wild animals. They walked for hundreds of miles, often at night to avoid detection, begging for food or sleeping in caves or run-down shelters. Alexandra carried a small pistol hidden in her robes, and Yongden had a revolver. They had to be constantly vigilant. She later wrote about the extreme physical hardship, the hunger that gnawed at them, the biting cold that made sleep almost impossible, the exhaustion that made every step a struggle. There were moments they nearly died from exposure or starvation. She even recounted using esoteric Tibetan practices like tumo, a meditation to generate internal heat, to survive the cold. Finally, in early 1924, after an arduous and dangerous journey, Alexandra David-Néel and Yongden walked into Lhasa. She was the first Western woman known to have entered the Forbidden City. They stayed there for 2 months, exploring the city, visiting monasteries including the Potala Palace, observing Tibetan life, all while maintaining their disguise. It was an astonishing achievement of endurance and willpower. When her identity was eventually revealed, she was asked to leave, but her mission was accomplished. She returned to Europe and became a sensation. She wrote numerous books about her travels and her understanding of Tibetan Buddhism, including My Journey to Lhasa. These books introduced many Westerners to the culture and spirituality of Tibet. Alexandra David-Néel continued to travel and write for many more years. Living to the extraordinary age of 100, she remained a symbol of adventure, intellectual curiosity, and an unbreakable spirit. Number 5. Ibn Battuta, the man who traveled further than anyone for centuries. Long before planes, trains, or even reliable maps of the whole world, a young Moroccan scholar named Abu Abdullah Muhammad ibn Battuta set off on a journey that would make him one of the greatest travelers in history. We're talking about the 14th century here. When he left his hometown of Tangier in 1325, at the age of 21, his initial plan was to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which was a common duty for Muslims. He thought he'd be gone for a couple of years. He ended up traveling for nearly 30 years. Ibn Battuta covered an estimated 75,000 miles, a distance that dwarfs the travels of his contemporaries, including Marco Polo. He visited almost every part of the Islamic world, from North and West Africa, through the Middle East, into Persia, Central Asia, India, Southeast Asia, and even parts of China and possibly as far as modern-day Russia. It was an immense area, connected by shared religion and trade routes, but still full of dangers and unknowns. He traveled by whatever means were available. On foot, by donkey, camel, caravan, or small dhow sailing ships. His journeys were not straightforward sightseeing tours. He was robbed by bandits multiple times. He nearly drowned in shipwrecks. He faced plagues and political upheavals. He served as a caddi, a judge, in several places, including Delhi in India and the Maldive Islands, because his legal training was in demand. His knowledge of Islamic law and his ability to speak Arabic fluently opened doors for him across this vast realm. In India, he worked for the Sultan of Delhi, Muhammad bin Tughlaq, for several years. The Sultan was known for his generosity, but also his erratic temper. Ibn Battuta experienced both. He was later appointed as the Sultan's ambassador to the Yuan court of China. His journey to China was itself an adventure, involving a shipwreck off the Indian coast where he lost all his possessions and nearly his life. He eventually made it to coastal cities in China, like Quanzhou, which he described as having a large Muslim merchant community. One of his most remarkable journeys was across the Sahara Desert to the Mali Empire in West Africa. He visited Timbuktu and the capital of Mali, meeting its powerful ruler, Mansa Suleiman. He described the wealth of the empire, its gold, its customs, and even things that surprised him, like the freedom women seemed to have there, which contrasted with other parts of the Muslim world he knew. He was impressed by the safety of the roads in Mali and the people's devotion to prayer. After nearly 3 decades on the road, Ibn Battuta finally returned to Morocco in the early 1350s. The Sultan of Morocco, Abu Inan Faris, was so impressed by his stories that he commissioned a young scholar, Ibn Juzayy, to write them down. This became the famous book known as the Rehla, or the Journey. Without this book, Ibn Battuta's incredible travels might have been lost to history. His detailed observations provide a unique window into the diverse cultures, societies, and political landscapes of the 14th century world, particularly the Islamic world at its peak. He wasn't exploring unknown territories in the sense of lands no human had ever seen, but he was charting the vastness of his known world for himself and through his writings for others. Number 4. Mary Kingsley and her very proper adventures in deadly West Africa. Picture a Victorian Englishwoman, always dressed in a long, practical black dress, made of sturdy material, venturing into parts of West Africa that many Europeans considered the white man's grave. This was Mary Kingsley. In the late 19th century, at a time when women, especially unmarried women, were expected to lead quiet domestic lives, Mary did the exact opposite. She became a daring explorer, ethnographer, and scientific collector in some of the most challenging environments on Earth. Mary had a restricted upbringing, mostly self-taught from her father's library, as she was expected to care for her invalid mother. When her parents died in quick succession in 1892, Mary, then in her early 30s, found herself with a small inheritance and a sudden, unexpected freedom. She decided to travel. Her goal was to go to West Africa to study traditional African religions and customs fetish, as it was then called, and also to collect fish specimens for the British Museum. Her first journey, in 1893, took her to Sierra Leone and Angola. Her second, more famous journey, from 1894 to 1895, saw her travel through what are now Nigeria, Cameroon, and Gabon. She often traveled alone, or with local guides and porters whom she treated with respect, learning their languages and customs. She wasn't like many other Europeans of her time. She genuinely tried to understand African cultures from their own perspective. Mary Kingsley was incredibly resourceful and brave. She canoed up remote rivers like the Ogu in Gabon, navigating treacherous waters and dense mangrove swamps. She trekked through jungles where few Europeans had dared to go. She traded goods like cloth, fishhooks, and tobacco with local tribes to pay for her passage and supplies. She faced dangers like crocodiles, leopards, tropical diseases, and navigating complex political situations between different tribes and European colonial powers. One of her most famous anecdotes involves falling into a game pit, a deep hole lined with sharp spikes designed to trap animals. She later wrote, with her characteristic dry wit, that her thick Victorian skirt saved her from serious injury. "It is at these times you realize the blessing of a good thick skirt," she remarked. She also climbed Mount Cameroon, a massive volcano, taking a route no European had taken before. Beyond her adventurous spirit, Mary was a keen observer and a serious scholar. She collected many new species of fish, some of which were named after her. She wrote detailed notes on the societies she visited, their laws, their beliefs, and their way of life. When she returned to England, she became a popular lecturer and wrote 2 successful books, Travels in West Africa, 1897, and West African Studies, 1899. In her writings and lectures, she often challenged the prevailing colonial attitudes and missionary practices of the time. She argued for a better understanding of African cultures and advocated for more just and informed British policies in Africa. She believed that British administrators should learn about and respect local customs. Mary Kingsley's life was cut short. She went to South Africa in 1900 to nurse Boer prisoners of war during the Second Boer War and died there of typhoid fever at the age of 37. But her legacy as a fearless and insightful explorer who defied conventions lived on. Number 3. Pedro Paez, the Jesuit, who found a legendary river source after years of slavery. The source of the Nile River was a mystery that puzzled ancient Egyptians, Greeks, and Romans for centuries. Many tried to find it, but the river's origins remained elusive. In the early 17th century, a Spanish Jesuit missionary named Pedro Paez may have become the first European to reach and accurately describe the source of the Blue Nile, one of the Nile's 2 major tributaries. But his journey to get there was an ordeal that involved shipwrecks, pirates, and years of brutal enslavement. Paez was born in Spain in 1564. He joined the Jesuit order and was eventually chosen for a mission to Ethiopia, a remote Christian kingdom in the Horn of Africa that had fascinated Europeans for centuries, sometimes being identified with the mythical kingdom of Prester John. In 1589, Paez set sail from Goa, India, for Ethiopia. However, his ship was attacked by pirates in the Red Sea, near the coast of Arabia. He and his companion, another Jesuit named Antonio de Montserrat, were captured. Their captivity was horrific. They were sold into slavery and forced to march across the brutal Hadramaut Desert in Yemen, often barefoot and with little water. They endured this for 7 long years, passed from one master to another, suffering incredible hardship and witnessing terrible cruelty. Montserrat eventually died from the ordeal. Paez, however, survived. He learned Arabic during his captivity and gained some knowledge of local customs. Finally, in 1596, he was ransomed by the Jesuits and managed to make his way back to Goa. Undeterred by his previous nightmare, Paez was still determined to reach Ethiopia. He spent several more years in India, preparing for a second attempt. In 1603, disguised as an Armenian merchant, he finally succeeded in reaching the Jesuit mission at Fermona in northern Ethiopia. In Ethiopia, Paez quickly learned the local languages, Amharic and Giz. He was a skilled diplomat and a man of considerable learning. He gained the trust and friendship of several Ethiopian emperors, including Susenyos I, who came to power in 1607. Páez impressed Susenyos with his knowledge of theology, architecture, and mechanics. He even helped design and build stone palaces and churches for the emperor, introducing European architectural styles to Ethiopia. It was during his time in Ethiopia, specifically on April 21, 1618, though some sources say 1613, that Pedro Páez visited the area around Lake Tana. He was taken to a place called Gish Abbey, where he saw two springs bubbling out of the ground in a grassy marsh. These springs were and are recognized by the Ethiopians as the source of the Abbey River, which is the Ethiopian name for the Blue Nile. Páez described the scene in detail in his History of Ethiopia. He wrote about the two round springs, the clearness of the water, and how the local people venerated the site. He noted that the water did not seem to taste special. His description was accurate and predates the more famous visit to the same site by the Scottish explorer James Bruce by more than 150 years. Páez played a significant role in Ethiopian religious politics. Emperor Susenyos, partly due to Páez's influence, eventually converted from Ethiopian Orthodox Christianity to Roman Catholicism in 1622. This was a hugely controversial move that led to widespread unrest and civil war in Ethiopia. Páez himself died in May 1622 in Gorgora, Ethiopia, before the full consequences of this religious shift unfolded. His extensive manuscript, Historia de Ethiopia, which detailed his travels, observations, and the history of the country, was not fully published until the 20th century. Because of this, his achievement in reaching the Blue Nile's source remained largely unknown to the wider world for a very long time, overshadowed by later explorers like James Bruce. Number 2. Jean Barret, the first woman to sail around the world, did it dressed as a man. In the 18th century, the world of maritime exploration was strictly a man's world. Women were generally not allowed on naval ships or scientific expeditions. But one woman, Jean Barret, managed to break this rule in a most audacious way. She disguised herself as a man and became the first woman known to circumnavigate the globe. Jean Barret was born in France in 1740. She came from a rural background and gained extensive knowledge of plants, likely working as an herb woman. This expertise brought her into the life of Philibert Commerson, a well-known naturalist and botanist. Barret became his housekeeper, and it's widely believed his lover. She also became his indispensable assistant in his botanical work. In 1766, Commerson was invited to join Louis-Antoine de Bougainville's expedition, which aimed to be the first French circumnavigation of the globe. Commerson was to be the expedition's naturalist, tasked with collecting plant and animal specimens from around the world. He was in poor health and needed an assistant. French naval regulations forbade women on board their ships. So, Jean Barret cut her hair, bound her chest, dressed in men's clothing, and signed on as Jean Barret, Commerson's valet and assistant. The expedition set sail from Nantes in late 1766 aboard two ships, the Boudeuse and the Étoile. Commerson and Jean Barret were on the Étoile, a store ship that was cramped and uncomfortable. For nearly 2 years, Jean Barret managed to maintain her disguise. It must have been incredibly difficult. She would have had to live in close quarters with hundreds of sailors, sharing their rough conditions, working hard, and constantly guarding her secret. She was described by others on the ship as being particularly diligent and strong, often carrying heavy loads of specimens and equipment during their shore excursions. Together, Barret and Commerson collected thousands of plant specimens from various locations they visited, including South America, Brazil, Patagonia, the Strait of Magellan, and many Pacific islands like Tahiti and New Ireland. Many of these plants were new to European science. It's thought that Barrett did much of the actual collecting and preparation of these specimens, given Commercon's frequent ill health. She was clearly a skilled botanist in her own right. One of the plants they collected, a vibrant flowering vine from Brazil, was later named Bougainvillea by Commercon in honor of the expedition's commander. There's even a plant, Solanum barratiae, named after her much later. How and when her gender was discovered is a subject of some debate. Bougainville's journal states that her identity was revealed in Tahiti in April 1768, when Tahitian islanders, who he claimed were more astute at recognizing gender, immediately pointed her out as a woman. However, other accounts, including one from a fellow officer, suggest her secret might have been discovered later, possibly through an assault or by being caught off guard. Whatever the exact circumstances, once her identity was known, it caused a stir. When the expedition reached Mauritius, then called Isle de France, a French territory in the Indian Ocean in 1768, Commercon and Barrett left the ship. Commercon was very ill, and they stayed as guests of Pierre Poivre, another famous botanist and the governor of the island. Commercon died in Mauritius in 1773. Jean Barrett remained on Mauritius for several years. She eventually married a French naval officer, Jean Dubernat, in 1774. Sometime in 1775 or 1776, she and her husband returned to France, thus completing her circumnavigation. When she returned, she was recognized for her work and even received a pension from the French Navy in 1785 for her services as a botanist on Bougainville's expedition. For a long time, her story was a footnote in the accounts of Bougainville and Commercon, but in recent decades, her remarkable achievement as a pioneering scientist and the first woman to circle the globe has been increasingly recognized. Number 1. Pytheas, the ancient Greek who sailed to a land of ice and midnight sun. Imagine it's around 325 BC. The ancient Greek world is buzzing with the conquests of Alexander the Great. Far to the west, in the Greek colony of Massalia, modern-day Morse in France, an astronomer and geographer named Pytheas decides to embark on an astonishing voyage. Plans to sail north, out of the Mediterranean, into the vast mysterious Atlantic Ocean, to explore the lands where tin came from, and perhaps even further. This was a journey into truly uncharted waters for the Greeks of his time. Pytheas was a man of science. He was reportedly skilled in mathematics and astronomy, and he knew how to use a gnomon, a type of sundial, to determine latitude. His account of his voyage, a work titled On the Ocean, Peri Oceanu, is now lost. We only know about his journey through a few snippets and references, often critical or disbelieving, written by later Greek and Roman authors like Strabo, Pliny the Elder, and Diodorus Siculus. These later writers often doubted Pytheas's claims, which seemed too fantastical to be true. According to these fragmented accounts, Pytheas sailed out through the Pillars of Hercules, the Strait of Gibraltar, and then turned north along the coasts of what are now Spain and France. He reached Brittany, a region known for its tin trade, a vital metal for making bronze. He then sailed across the Channel to Britain, which he called Britannique, or Britannia. He is said to have circumnavigated a large part of Britain, or at least traveled extensively around its coasts. He described the island as being triangular in shape and gave estimates of its coastline dimensions. He wrote about the Celtic inhabitants, their customs, their farming practices, they grew wheat, and how they brewed a drink made from grain and honey, probably mead or ale. Pytheas didn't stop there. He reported sailing 6 days north of Britain to a land he called Thule. This is one of the most intriguing and debated parts of his journey. Where was Thule? Some scholars think it might have been Iceland. Others suggest the coast of Norway, or perhaps the Shetland or Faroe Islands. Pytheas described Thule as a place where, in summer, the sun barely set. He said that at the summer solstice, the sun passed through the northern sky and there was continuous daylight for some period. This is an accurate description of the midnight sun phenomenon experienced in far northern latitudes. He also described something even stranger. Near Thule, he said, the sea became thick and sluggish like a sea lung, Clumen Phalladios. He described it as a substance in which neither earth, water, nor air exists separately, but a kind of congealed mixture of all three, through which one could neither walk nor sail. This has been interpreted by many as an early European description of pancake ice or slush ice, the partially frozen sea found in Arctic or subarctic waters. The idea of a frozen sea was utterly alien to people living in the warm Mediterranean. Pytheas also reportedly visited the Baltic Sea region, perhaps drawn by tales of amber. Another valuable trade good. He is said to have observed the tides, correctly linking them to the moon, which was a significant scientific insight for his time. When Pytheas returned to Massalia and wrote about his discoveries, many, especially later geographers like Strabo, dismissed him as a liar or a teller of tall tales. The idea of a land of midnight sun and a frozen ocean seemed too far-fetched. How could there be inhabited lands so far north? How could the sea freeze? For centuries, his accounts were largely discredited. However, modern understanding of geography and the conditions in northern Europe suggests that many of Pytheas's observations were remarkably accurate, especially for a lone explorer from the Mediterranean in the 4th century BC. He was a pioneer who ventured into the unknown northern seas and brought back some of the earliest reliable information about Britain in the fringes of the Arctic world, even if few believed him at the time.